Welcome to the Freedom Club podcast, where we discover the fight for freedom, fulfillment, passion, and purpose. Your host is Kurt Mercadante, Gallup certified strengths coach, an agency founder who is dedicated to coaching individuals seeking to level up their life and their businesses. The Freedom Club is about unlocking your talents, turning them into strengths, and crushing your objectives. You can learn more at kurtmercadante.com. Welcome to the Freedom Club.
And this is the Freedom Club podcast. I'm your host, Kurt Mercadante. It is Thursday, April 19th, which means it's time for our Thursday interview segment. Every Monday, I bring you the Monday Motivator, a short burst of motivation to help you kick your week off on the right foot. Every Thursday is our interview segment in which I interview a business leader or some other all-around interesting person. And my friends, today you have a treat. I interview Dr. Josh Luke. He's a healthcare futurist, a former hospital CEO, executive edutainer, and speaker, and he's also the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller, Health Wealth is Healthcare Bankrupting Your Business? 9 Steps to Financial Recovery. I thank you so much for listening today, and without further delay, here is my interview with Dr. Josh Luke. Well, this is the Freedom Club podcast. I'm your host, Kurt Mercadante, and I am here with Dr. Josh Luke, author of Health Wealth, 9 Steps to Financial Recovery. How you doing, Dr. Luke?
I'm well. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look on LinkedIn, Dr. Luke is he's all about healthcare affordability, but also a healthcare futurist and edutainer. Which that last part, edutainer. You talk about it a little bit in the book, but what does that mean?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked about the edutainer piece, because usually I get asked about the healthcare futurist piece, and they kind of go hand in hand, which is, I'll give you kind of the short version of my history, which is I worked in sports marketing coming out of college. That was my dream. I had 2 older brothers that were professional athletes, and that's a lot of pressure for a high school kid, right? My older brother, Matt, played ball for the Yankees and Dodgers and Angels, and then my older brother, Scott, was a professional triathlete who did Ironman, and sometime during my senior year in high school, I was sitting there on the bench watching my teammates play basketball, and I said, maybe God didn't bless me the same way he did my brothers. So I said, maybe my goal should be to work in sports marketing instead of play on the field. And I did that. After I got out of graduate school, within a year, I think I'd worked for all 4 of the major sporting leagues through my agency or through internships. And then it was actually the year Mark McGwire broke the home run record. In 1998, I was doing his personal marketing in public relations for my agency, and we flew on a private jet to New York and went on the David Letterman show and Today Show and Time Magazine. It was amazing, but it was actually on that private jet on the way back with my wife. We got married 3 days before that trip, so whirlwind trip. And I just looked at her and said, man, my priorities have changed like overnight getting married, and my dream of working in sports marketing, all of a sudden it doesn't seem right on. And I think I want to do something different. Don't know what it is. But what happened is within a few months, my grandmother was sick, and I was really frustrated about the lack of communication between her caretakers and the fact that she couldn't afford basic care. So I made this switch to healthcare administration and ran nursing homes, and then became a hospital CEO through some successes just within a few years. And by 32, I was a hospital CEO. And so when the Affordable Care Act passed, I started doing a lot of speaking. I always felt that I was blessed to be a speaker, and so I was out there loving it. And people were saying, man, you have a lot more to say on this on most people. A, because you didn't grow up in the healthcare industry, so to speak, but B, because you worked in nursing homes first. And so I started reading policy and saying, here's how it's going to impact people. And that became the healthcare futurist component, because I was saying, here's what's going to happen. And then the edutainer component was, I realized at an event, I was sitting at an event, Kurt, you'll love this, where they invited me to speak for free, kind of as a content speaker for healthcare executives. And then they had the paid speaker, whether it was, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, I don't know what it was, but she was supposed to entertain us, and it was a full session. There was 400 people instead of the 150 I had. And I was sitting there, and I had to go because I got an award for something I was doing on healthcare strategy. And I'm sitting there thinking, she's terrible. She's not entertaining. And every time she tries to act like she knows something about healthcare, it makes it more obvious she doesn't. And that was the day I really challenged myself back in 2012. I want to be an entertainer. And an entertainer who also educates is an edutainer. And there's a friend of mine on LinkedIn, for those of you who are big on LinkedIn. And if you're on LinkedIn, please follow me at Dr. Josh Luke. That's how Kurt and I met. That's how relationships are born, right?
Definitely.
But there's a great influencer overseas named Natalia Wachowski, who also is an edutainer. And her and I became friends about 2 years ago. And she's going to be at the Masters of LinkedIn Summit in Los Angeles on May 10th. And I'll be there too, if that's of interest to you. But her and I were the original edutainers on LinkedIn. And there's a lot of copycats now, but there's enough to go around. So that's the story of how I got these random titles: healthcare futurist and executive edutainer. But by the way, I educate all industries, not just healthcare, because I teach people about how to make healthcare affordable.
Sure, absolutely. And I want to get into the book and obviously about healthcare affordability. The name of this podcast is The Freedom Club. And I have a private Facebook group called The Freedom League. And, my mission in life is to help individuals fight for lives of freedom and fulfillment. And your book obviously gets into that, because one reason people feel like they're stuck maybe with golden handcuffs in a job they hate or misery is healthcare, the cost of healthcare, especially if they have children. But your journey, healthcare aside, it obviously played a part, was you were kind of like Jerry Maguire, right? You were working in sports marketing, and you decided to get out. I love the talk about, and the picture in the book of wearing the suits with the sandals. And so you created, and your journey was about creating a life of freedom for yourself and your family. What does the word freedom mean to you?
That's such a great question, and it's really a blessing, whether you're faithful or not. It's a blessing to be either born in a country where you're offered freedoms or to live there. And so I appreciate you asking that question, because I've never taken that for granted. And I parallel freedom a lot with entrepreneurism, and I read some books when I was young. And of course, everybody always says, recommend some books, and great starter books for somebody who wants to be financially free and to be an entrepreneur. The two I read, because literally I went to college for 10 years. I have 3 degrees, but I did not have one business class, right? I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and I read The Millionaire Next Door. And they're both 20 years old now, but they're both just as relevant. And there's 20 knockoffs of Rich Dad now, but read the original. And that book in particular talked about, if you work for somebody else, and they use the word slave, and I know that's a strong word that has some strong connotations, but at least that's how I interpret it. They literally wanted to make the point, you're a slave to your boss, period. Don't justify it. Don't make excuses. If you do not work for yourself, you are a slave to someone else. And that's how it was interpreted. And it really brought out an angry emotion in me, because I realized it was right. There was a sentence early in that book that said, if most upper middle class Americans were raised to go to college, borrow money to get through college, borrow money to have an extravagant wedding with this person they meet at college, get a job working for somebody, a good job so mom and dad are happy, buy a house by borrowing money, and basically to live in debt, and the key word is, and to die in debt, because you can never recover from that debt. And that really was the moment that I realized that freedom was so much more broader than just being able to come and go as you want. That there's a sense of financial freedom, and again, if you're faith-based, it's biblical as well, that when you owe people money, you're not free. And so freedom to me is an amazing thing. I never, ever take it for granted. And I want to honor those who have that freedom here in the United States by sharing with them. I was a hospital CEO, and there's a problem. There's a problem because Americans can't afford health care. Not just you as an individual, but businesses can't. If you aren't as fired up about this as I am, folks, think about the businesses this year that have basically declared war on healthcare and declared their tipping point. You might have heard of a couple of them: Amazon, right, Disney, Apple, Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan, and Walmart did the old, hey, if you can't beat them, join them. I'm sorry, we're going to rewrite that cliche. If you can't beat them, buy them. With Humana, the insurer. They're going to buy them because the most efficient company in the world, Walmart, says we cannot control healthcare costs. So the best thing for us to do is to buy the company and to teach them how to be efficient. So that's pretty cool. All of that happened since January 18th of 2018. It's all in the first half of this year. It's crazy.
And it's, when you think about America as the land of the free, there's a number of organizations that do rankings, Freedom Index rankings, and the U.S. keeps falling behind. And when you look at a lot of our big, complex industries, right? The military industrial complex. You look at higher education especially, but middle education, et cetera, healthcare. It's almost as if there's all these bubbles going on. In your book, you talk about the pricing bubble in healthcare. It reminds me similar to the student loan bubble that we're facing. And I've talked to some people in the investment industry that it's reaching a tipping point when college costs 60 grand a year to go to, and the inflation keeps going up and up. And I mentioned this before we got on in terms of whether it's capitalism or what. I think what happens is that these big industries become so big that people get caught up in the system, and invariably, and I'm not fundamentally anti-government, but the industry comes to rely on government for certain things, whether they're subsidies, handouts, and it's less of a capitalism and more of well, it's certainly not a free market. And I don't know what you call it, a command capitalism or something like that.
Yeah.
But you talk in your book about, when I think of a free market, I think of flowing water, right? And if you stick your finger in the flowing water, what is it? It comes over here. Well, someone over here is not going to like it. So they get someone to stick there, and it keeps going. And you talk about in your book all the middlemen in the healthcare industry and third party. And I can't remember who it was, but they said if we had health insurance for groceries, a can of peas would be $150, right? Because no one knows the true cost of it.
Yeah.
And I have some personal stories. My wife is a speech language pathologist, and when she was working, she would work in nursing homes, and she would work and a lot of it was paid through by Medicare. Mm-hmm. And the things that she would see, because the incentives are created to charge twice as much because they're only going to reimburse half the amount. There were some things. You talk about this in your book, and it's so frustrating, but I think unfortunately it can be applied to a number of different pieces where we don't actually know the true cost of goods and services.
That's the point.
I'm going to go look for my pricing for my open heart surgery. Yeah. Can't do it, right? Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about the problem and where it started.
Yeah, so it's interesting. In March of 2017, I got a call from Forbes Books. And of course, Forbes is the gold standard in business. And they said, hey, we're looking for somebody to write a book on healthcare affordability. And we've been searching on LinkedIn. We got quite a few people that we think are experts, but we like your position as an industry insider, a provider, because most of the others who are experts are brokers. They're trying to sell this, and you're just trying to say, hey, there's a problem. And you're pulling back the curtain, and I think that's just, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a proud Gen Xer. I grew up in the 80s. I love that era. I became a hospital CEO at age 32, and I asked a lot of questions. And to this day, 20 years later, there's still not a lot of answers, right? So when it comes to when Forbes reached out to me and said, hey, we actually narrowed it down, and you're the guy we think should write this book, I woke up the next morning and said to my wife, but this isn't my expertise, teaching American businesses how to save money, but they obviously think I'm capable, so I got to start researching. But she said, well, what's the challenge? You've already published 2 books. You've done well. One's a bestseller. What's the issue? And I said, well, the issue is it's got to be a passion, right? And it is a passion. She said, are you crazy? You're out of control on LinkedIn. And when you speak about how passionate you are about making healthcare affordable for people. And I said, okay. I thought about when I was between jobs. I'd been a hospital CEO for 10 years, and hospital CEOs last 1.5 to 3 years on average. Then they pay you for a few months to go away and find a new job, right? And so luckily I had a couple months severance pay, but I remember looking at my wife and saying, hey, it's time for us to pay for Cobra. It's somewhere between $1,300 and $2,000 a month with our 3 children who were in middle school at the time. And I just said, hey, I don't have any income. I can't justify this, knowing the system as I do and how unfair it is. And she was willing to support me. And that was a pretty risky proposition for having 3 children in middle school. But the day I woke up that morning and decided to write the book for Forbes, I looked at her and I go, gosh, and I hope this doesn't sound arrogant because it's not intended to be, but we were blessed to have great income and to be the CEO of a hospital, have a 6-figure income for almost 10 years, be good stewards, save money, put it away. And when we're out of work for just a few months, if we can't afford healthcare, who can? We're not somebody who's just struggling to get by. And that was one of the convicting moments that said, I need to write this book. And I need to become what Forbes, coined as America's healthcare affordability authority. So to answer your question, that was one of the personal moments where I said, gosh, this is real. And every American family is going bankrupt. And that's the full name, is healthcare bankrupting your business. Now in September, so as you showed, this is Health Wealth is healthcare bankrupting your business, 9 steps to financial recovery. In September, we're going to do Health Wealth for families.
Oh,
and
great.
There's going to be 7 or 8 ways to save $7K or $8K, and it's going to talk to you as the individual. But what's really been convicting, Kurt, is that my book came out on January 18th. You might have known I threw that random date out earlier because the same day was when the first of these announcements came out, and it's been weekly since then. Walmart, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway, Amazon, they just keep coming. Disney, every week there's a new one that said Apple's putting clinics in their offices because nobody can afford healthcare. So the timing is ideal. But to get to the root of the question you asked is, where does the problem lie? Well, and as you saw reading the book, there's a lot of middlemen, and you can't just point the finger at hospitals, and then insurers point the finger at hospitals, but insurers are just as guilty. But the problem starts with hospitals who do not want you to know how much healthcare services cost. I need to go get an x-ray on something this week, and I'm not even calling my insurance. I'm calling around to a few outpatient providers and say, what's your cash rate? Because I know in a high deductible plan, it's going to be less expensive for me to say, here's $150 for some x-rays.
It's interesting because there's been some, I was just talking to my wife the other day that I remember when I was a kid, if you were sick, you had your family doctor. And mine was Dr. Kudjaker and Dr. Karatowicz, right? And they had their own, there was 3 guys, they had a practice, and I would go there and we'd get an appointment and we would get in the same day. Okay. Now, everyone here locally, and it was the same when I lived up in Illinois, seems to be, I don't even know who the doctor is. It's affiliated with the hospital. And you talk about this in your book, and there's no, it doesn't seem that there's any independent doctors anymore. There's some pediatricians who are, but when you get to be an adult, they're all through the hospital. And there was a for-profit center, outpatient center that popped up around here. Okay. And they ended up losing some money, but it was related to the fact that they were doing something, they were competing with the hospitals. And I think the hospitals sicked the government after them about doing certain tests. They had the word emergency on their thing. They went after them, made them take that down. They basically ran this company out of business. And, it's funny looking at that and reading your book. I'm like, yeah, they didn't like the competition, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's exactly what's going on. So in my prior book, and it's right here, Execute, Excellent. A former hospital CEO tells all on what's wrong with American healthcare, what every American needs to know. This was an Amazon bestseller, as was Health Wealth. But chapter 5, this might sound familiar. You just talked about this. Whatever happened to the personal family physician, page 34. And one thing I'll tell you about this book, if this is kind of new to you, but you're like, man, this is kind of some cool stuff that Kurt and Dr. Luke are talking about, start with Execute. Go on Amazon, grab them both. They're both available in Kindle, and I think Health Wealth will be available in audio soon here as well in the next week or so. This one's a little more fun and lighthearted. It'll make you laugh. It'll make you cry. It'll entertain you a little bit. The biggest compliment I get on Execute is there's 2 chapters called Caring for Mom. And if you're an adult, a child like Kurt and I are, and you have your parents that are still in their golden years or are starting that process, these 2 chapters define the difference between a nursing home, an assisted living, adult daycare, home care, home health. There's a page, it's 1 page on each, and it says, here's what you need to know. Here's how it's paid for. Here's a dirty little secret they don't want you to know, which I think people love that I include that. So this book is a better starter book, and then Health Wealth really gets down to, all right, now let's talk about how you can save money personally on healthcare. And I'll give you a hint. The way to save money on healthcare starts with 3 Ps. Have a plan based on personalized medicine and preventative medicine. So that's where you can start. And if you want to know more, I have a blog at health-wealthblog.com where we talk a lot about this stuff, but I want to stay on focus with what Kurt wants to talk about today. Or you go to healthwealth.com, health-wealth.com.
This is great. And the fact that you're coming out with a book about families, that was one of my questions because it was geared toward businesses and how there's a lot of great, in this book, Health Wealth, as healthcare bankrupting your business, there's a number of things if you work at a company, but also you stress this repeatedly that, doctors, healthcare providers are not all knowing gods. Challenge them on certain things, right? Ask. And you've done that. I think it was your son, right? Had some tests run and you challenged him and said, I'm not paying this. And
not just with payment. So let's clarify, because as a hospital CEO, when you called to complain and also wanted to talk about your bill, I'd say, well, that we have separate people to do that. And the separate people is I handle this one and I handle this one, but not on the same phone call, right? Because we don't want to talk about quality and service and payment, because then you win that battle when I'm on the other side. But the point you're trying to make, Kurt, is this. Why is it as Americans that we feel empowered to second guess and question and research everything except for our doctor?
Right.
Now, you'll be amazed how many times somebody would say, hey, Kurt, your mom came to the hospital. She's better now. We need to send her to a convalescent home for a few days. She's going to do some rehab there, and then she'll go home. You'd be amazed how many Americans are like, oh, I'm sad my mom has to go to home. But if you just did this one thing that takes 10 seconds, I'll tell you how the doctor reacts. Hey, doc, does mom have to go there? Because I promised her I would never send her to a nursing home. Are there any other options? Here's how he or she would react. Oh, yeah, we can send her home. Just know it's not quite as safe, and you might need to do a little extra. And I've seen it happen 100 times. But those 100 times should have been 10,000 times, because those were the only 100 times that people were smart enough and strong enough to be empowered to say, hey, doc, are there any other options? Most Americans feel like it's offensive to say that to a doctor.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I totally get that. I have, it's 9 years now. I had problems for 10 years, digestion, urgent care, stomach issues. And the doctor would just prescribe me something. And the drug sometimes had side effects that would make me feel crazy. And I read a blog post about the paleo lifestyle, diet.
Sure.
9 years I've done that. My anxiety, I used to have anxiety attacks. My cholesterol is the best, he said, that my good cholesterol in a male my age. He said, what are you doing? I said, well, I eat bacon every day. I eat eggs. I eat red meat. He's like, keep doing it. And I tell some people, they're like, no. I don't care what your doctor said. My doctor said this. I said, just do your own research, and you talk about that. It used to be called Eastern mystic medicine. And now it's wellness. It's preventative medicine. I want to ask you about, you basically have a roadmap that businesses can take. But some of those lessons I think families can take as well in terms of that. But one interesting piece that you talked about is,
can I real quick before you ask that question?
Yeah.
Your last comment hit on 3 key elements of the book Health Wealth.
Sure.
You have a diet that's worked for you. Remember we talked about the 3 Ps: preventative, which you took action, and personalized, because everybody reacts differently. And you know this. One of the 9 steps in Health Wealth is DNA testing and full genome sequencing.
Yeah.
And what Kurt described, whether he did a genome test and DNA test or not, which, by the way, this is how long it takes. Send it to the lab, okay? It costs about $1,000 for the full genome, but half that for partial. But what he just described is what's called nutrigenetics, okay? And there's also pharmacogenetics. Pharmacogenetics, this science is 100% real. And so let's take his example of bacon and meat. There's a chapter in the book where we talk about DNA testing where his friend said, you're crazy, that can't be right. Science says it's not correct. Well, they're referring to old science. New science with DNA testing shows exactly how his body metabolizes those foods. And in some cases, they're fuels for him where they might not be for others. Right. Now, nutrigenetics, the technology is not as advanced as pharmacogenetics, but it's Kurt is an example of, I don't need any more doctors to show me and tell me. I started and changed. My body obviously metabolizes these things better. Pharmacogenetics is a real technology where I've had people and met people who said doctors kept upping my dose on this until I got my DNA test, which showed this my body doesn't metabolize that medication. So he talked about that, number one, and that's personalized medicine at its best, and it's here and it's real. The second thing that you covered in that one little comment, which was great, was it used to be called Eastern medicine. That's my last step of 9. I call it naturopathic and integrative medicine. And what I learned in researching it, because I knew very little about it at the time, but one of my good friends who's a millennial, and I talk a lot about millennial culture in my books, okay, he started a integrative medicine company called Harvey. Check it out. Harvey.com or GoHarvey.com, one or the other. But anyway, what he said to me, and I went and researched it, there was more than 150 university programs in the United States of America in the 50s and 60s about Eastern medicine and natural medicine. I agree with you that Eastern kind of brings a little negative connotation, but natural doesn't. There's a reemergence now, and here's the short version of this. Western medicine is that the pharmaceutical companies brainwashed us in the 60s and 70s that if you're sick, you need a pill. I admit, I'm a Gen Xer, and I thought that they won that battle. What we're experiencing now in 2017 and 18 and moving forward is you need both. You need Western and you need natural. And that's where the preventative and the personalized come in. And you mentioned the term wellness. It's really living healthy. Wellness kind of brings some negative connotations as well at times. Healthy lifestyles leads to less healthcare costs. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but you hit so much of it in one little comment. I wanted to go back.
Yeah, no. I appreciate that. That's excellent because it's interesting that, I mean, we live our lives, my wife and I, a few different ways. We homeschool and, people get comments, right? You're not supposed to question the education system. You're not supposed to question these other things. But I will tell people about my paleo diet, and it's getting a little more mainstream now. Yeah. And people just, oh, you're not a man. You don't eat gluten. You don't eat this. It's like, all right, I don't want to have a beer and be in urgent care tomorrow, Yeah. But you mentioned this in the Eastern and the Western, and that notion that we need a pill to make us better. And it's so interesting that the culture today, with that in mind, they'll say, well, I'll tell them about my cholesterol. And I have some different ideas on cholesterol and good or bad, whatever. But my cholesterol is great. And they say, well, I'm fine. I take Lipitor, so I'm not going to have a heart attack. So I can eat as much fried chicken as I want. And it's like, yeah, but you're not worrying about the cancer. You're not worrying about every other. And then, well, I'm taking a drug for that. And it's just so, you hit the nail on the head of I talk about my wife all the time. I got a pill for this. I got a pill for this. And next thing you know, someone's on 8 pills when they could just eat healthy.
It's a small amount for a senior citizen. That's a low amount. The average is about 12 in most nursing homes. So
I would never remember it. One question that I have is, and maybe you'll hit on more of this in your next book, but when we talk about things that businesses can do, and it's centered, because that's the system we're in now. Sure. It's a third-party healthcare. Tax credits go to the businesses. It's provided by business, which wasn't always that way. And I can't remember if it was World War I or II, right, where they wanted to attract better workers, competitive, and so they started offering it. But when you talk about not knowing, you talk about consumer-driven healthcare. Yeah. And maybe you don't talk about it because it's just never going to happen realistically. The policy implications are too big. But tearing it away from businesses, because especially in this new economy with millennials, no one is staying in a job for 20 or 40 years like they used to. Sure. They go from job to job, and as a small business owner, it's a pain. And rather having the tax credits and the incentives follow the person instead of the business, would that be, what do you think is the problem with that? And wouldn't that lead to truly consumer-driven healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I say that sounds like kind of a political fix that, let's give people money, which is, these HSAs, these healthcare savings accounts. So that's a good start because, they're making you think. You used a term that is huge in my book, the consumer-driven healthcare. You hear it sometimes referred to as consumerism. And so let's play a hypothetical game for a second. So your 16-year-old daughter, it's her birthday today. She couldn't wait to get her license. She was at the DMV at 8 a.m. She passed the test. She printed out the car she wanted 3 weeks ago, every feature. And you and your partner said, hey, we're going to take her down to get her new car. We're going to pay for half of it, you and your spouse. So you jump in the car at 9 a.m. You drive down Auto Center Lane. You come to the stoplight, right? And she's hanging out. Your daughter's hanging out the back window, and you and your spouse are in the front, and she says, Daddy, there it is on the left, the exact car I want. It's white. It's the right color. It's got the right features. It's on the same radio station I like. I can hear my favorite song. In the window, in your big yellow and red letters, it says $16,000, right? And then your wife's on the other side of you, and she says, hey, look, it's over here on the right side of the street, too. Same exact car, same color, same features, same radio station, but the stickers on the window say $42,000. So here's what I always say when I'm speaking, because I'm a public speaker. If you need a public speaker, give me a shout out on LinkedIn. I'll send you the information. But so what I say here is, hey, Dad, which way are you going to turn, right? Because most dads I know would pretend like they didn't hear Mom because I want the $16,000 version. I'll ask what the difference is when I get there. But here's the point I want to make. Think about, you as listeners and those that are on live right now, okay? Think about in the last 15 or 20 years when you had to have a baby or a surgery, a procedure, or a test, you had this moment of truth, but you were led to believe that your insurance would pay for it. okay, which is true in that moment, but the next year when you get an increase from your company, you paid for it when you picked the higher cost center. And this is called becoming consumer-driven healthcare and consumerism. You're engaging in the process, because I'm not afraid to admit it. When my insurance company gave me a blank check, I turned right and went to the $42,000 car and said, hey, what's the difference between you and this one across the street? But the smart American consumer would always turn left if it was their own money and say, what's the difference? And the guy on the left would say, we've been wondering that for years. The only difference is that car is 60% more expensive. I want to parallel that to hospitals. There is not 1 ounce of exaggeration in this story. That is the exact thing that happens in hospitals every day. There's a 60% price disparity from that corner to this corner right across the street. And here's a little tidbit for you. The same doctor is going to operate on you on both sides of the street. Okay, so that car story is, people go, man, that was such a great example of why I need to engage. And so if you want to start a conversation about this with somebody, here's a simpler way to say it. Hey, when we shop for cars, we shop features and prices. When we shop for houses, we shop neighborhoods and school districts and number of bedrooms. Why don't we do that in healthcare? And that's really what we beg in this book, Health Wealth, is how to become what I call an EHC, an engaged healthcare consumer. And you know what? I didn't even come up with that term until after this book was published. So in the rewritten versions, I'm going to sneak in a sentence about becoming an engaged healthcare consumer. But when you engage in the process, as I've just described, your costs will start to come down. So I don't know if I answered your question directly. I don't think the government giving us money or HSAs or even just high deductible plans solves the problem. I think all of them put us in a position, and Kurt, as you said, you went to your wife and said, hey, a high deductible plan isn't just our company making us pay more. We actually can save if we engage in the process and pick the hospital on the left. And Kurt mentioned it in passing a minute ago. The hospital on the left is called a center of excellence. It's sometimes referred to as a center of value. And what that means is they have contracted, sometimes you hear it called a narrow network or in-network. They've contracted with your provider to do it at a less, your procedure at a less cost for them and for you. And the best tidbit I can give you on healthcare savings right now in 10 seconds or less is when it's time for you to have that procedure. If you go to your HR department and say, hey, I have to pay $5,000 to go to the hospital on the street across on the right as a copay, and only $1,000 at the center of excellence on the left. So if that's the case, your company's paying 5 times what you are, right? So you say to them, hey, will you pay my $1,000 copay if I go to the hospital on the left? And they might go, why would I do that? And then say, look how much it's going to cost you if I choose the hospital on the right. It might cost them $40,000 more based on where you go. And you educating them is the best thing that can happen to them, because they should be educating you. You'd be amazed how many times they go, yeah, we'll pay your $1,000. Don't even worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I brought up the tax credits just as an example, but it seems that the system is geared toward, 2/3, 65%, something like this, of all jobs are created by small businesses. Mm-hmm. And the economy, especially with millennials, job hopping, but it seems like the system is still geared toward the other 35%, toward big business, right?
Yep.
What do you think is going to happen with the tipping point where that small businesses, the entrepreneurial people who, the freelance economy happens when the system is geared toward businesses where you used to work for someplace for 30 years, but you leave your job and you have to go through the whole process again? Is there going to be a tipping point?
So yeah, and I think we've reached it. So I have a great story to go with that. I was actually speaking over in China the night of the last presidential election, and so my phone starts blowing up in the middle of the night. With people going, oh my gosh, it looks like Trump's going to win. How's this going to impact healthcare? And my high school buddy, all of a sudden they declared Trump the victor. And my high school buddy does what high school buddies are supposed to do, because I'd been a public speaker on value-based care and transformational healthcare and healthcare affordability for a couple of years. My first book hit bestseller. So he's like, okay, Mr. Obamacare, what are you going to talk about now? And I had that moment of, oh my gosh, my heart skipped, like maybe he's right. And then I went, wait a minute, I've never said I'm for or against Obamacare. I've always just said I'm going to translate it as a futurist and tell you how it's going to impact you. But what that made me realize is that Medicare has no money left. So they can't go back to a system with no checks and balances. And American companies are going out of business. So when that happened, LinkedIn, who I wrote for their healthcare pulse, and I write for Forbes.com as well, reached out and said, hey, nobody was expecting this. We need you to write a column on what's going to happen to healthcare. And I'm like, I don't know. Let me think about it. Nobody was expecting this. And so a GOP majority, a GOP president, Obamacare certainly is not going to last as we know it. So, but what does that mean? You got to be better than that, Josh. And so you know what I came up with, which is look, President Trump is, free market or capitalist, whichever, or both. Okay. So he's going to be pro-business. So that much I didn't need to do any research to find. But he also is going to appeal to those who got him elected by declaring it dead the first minute he's allowed to, right? Which is exactly what he did. But I went out on a limb and I made a prediction within 4 days of the election that not much would happen initially, even though he would declare it dead, because this thing was just a sticky wicket that took a long time to put together. And a lot of it was done through, President Obama's signature without the support he may or may not have needed. And so what I said is, hey, he's going to declare it dead, but it's going to take months to undo it. And I kind of think that's a good thing, because now we're going to talk about each piece. But what I know the pieces they're going to go after, because this is what the Republicans do when they have a majority, they go right after the taxes, right? Which is what they did. And they're going to go right after the mandate, which says you have to have health care and I have to have health care, because that was the piece that people said, man, this is just really complicated it. And let me tell you what, and by the way, those are the only two things that have really happened so far. And we're now 18 months later. And even today I read some articles that the states are now starting to engage based on what's best for them. And I think that's a positive. But let me share with you a story that I have on LinkedIn that if you go to my page and you click on stories and scroll down, you'll see this story. It was one of the most controversial ones I read, but it went viral. I wrote, and it talked about when I was a hospital CEO. Americans, particularly immigrants, know that when you go into a hospital emergency department, we are required by law to treat you. We can't ask if you can pay for it or not. We have to treat you first, ask questions later, and if the answer is I can't pay, then they don't have to pay. You bill them and you write it off. So I tell the story about how I was the CEO of 2 hospitals in Anaheim, California, largely Latino immigrant community. A lot of times walk into the ED, get cared for, never had a primary care physician. I remember specifically one time a guy came in, his daughter was getting cared for, and I went into the cafeteria after he was done to eat lunch. We had this great cafeteria, and I was in line, and I just happened to be behind him in line. And as a CEO, I always felt like it was important to wait in line, not take cuts. I didn't want to be that guy. And I couldn't help but notice when he opened his wallet that he had probably, and I really wasn't being nosy. He just opened it up, and there it was. He probably had $1,000 and hundreds in his wallet. And, it didn't really offend me. This is the community I served, the community I worked in. And a lot of times, there wasn't a lot of trust for banks, so there was cash flowing around. But this is also somebody who'd just been in my emergency department and said he couldn't afford to pay for anything because he understood the system, right? He understood that I didn't have any way to hold him accountable. But I tell that story, and some people got offended and said, hey, you're using too many adjectives, which, I don't think I've said anything offensive, but my kids would have said I've said 2 things that are expensive because they've been raised in
people get offended by everything. So.
Yeah, it's much more politically correct. So and even my students at USC, so I teach healthcare at USC to graduate students, and I let them proof my stories because their input's valuable. A couple of them said, man, some of this seems a little offensive, but I'll remember that story of you in a suit looking over the shoulder of an immigrant. And I said, and they were saying it in a bad way, and I said, I want you to remember it. I create visuals when I write. That's what I do. That's my goal. So if you remember it, we're good. But the point is we have to treat you when you come into our AD. But here's the main point, Kurt. Do you think if I patted that guy on the back and said, hey, congratulations, Obamacare just passed. The great news is your whole family gets health care insurance now. It's only going to cost you $400 a month. How do you think he's going to react? I don't even need to tell you how he's going to react. You know he's going to react. He's going to say, I'm not interested, right?
Yeah, right.
And I always go back to that story because the mandate assumed everybody who didn't have it wanted it. Imagine if you peeled off the 40% of people who just said, I have no interest, how much less the cost would be.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you
especially even young millennials, right? Or millennials who are, they're indestructible, right? I don't need health insurance.
Well, my dad's a tax guy, right? And we're sitting on a bar stool in 2012 at the local watering hole, and my dad and I live 10 minutes away. And I know if I'm driving by there, because it's between my kid's high school and my home, if I'm driving by and I see his car, I'll pull in some afternoons, just give him a hug, say hi for 10 minutes. And so he says to me in 2011 or 12, I think it was 12 or 13, he goes, hey, so what's up with Obamacare? Is it working? Is it not working? And da-da-da-da. And I said, Dad, So you're the perfect person to ask this question. I don't know a single guy under the age of 40 that would have ever had any thought or paid a dime for health insurance unless he got married and his wife made him, which is what happened to me. Because we think we're invincible. We think we're indestructible, right? And so they built this legislature on the young folks paying for the seniors who need it, the young folks engaging, enrolling, and being healthy, and paying for the seniors who need the care. And I said, Dad, you're a tax guy. How many of your clients that are millennials actually paid for Obamacare in the first 2 years? And how many of them did you have to say, hey, bud, I'm about to tell you what your tax refund is going to be this year, but I have to tag on an extra $195 that I'm going to deduct from the $3,000 you're getting in your refund because you didn't enroll. And that guy, to him, his only thought about Obamacare for the year was a 5-second statement from my dad that meant he only got $3,400 instead of $3,600. And if he had asked a question, well, how much would it cost if I got it? It would have been $200 to $400 a month. So it would have just said, yeah, keep it going, right? I don't think it was until last year that penalty increased to almost $500. So those are the two things I always said about the Affordable Care Act that made me say, hey, I'm not sure this is going to work for these two reasons, because not everybody wants health care.
And when you talk about emergency room overutilization, right? And those costs are passed on. Yeah. It's interesting because, and it's funny, when I read that, I immediately thought, oh, someone's going to get offended by what you were writing. And I don't get offended by anything. I don't really care. But I think it was Oregon. There's been a debate over the expansion of Medicaid in the states. And I believe it was Oregon that did a study that showed the increase in Medicaid just had a massive increase in people using the emergency room for, I have a cold.
Yeah.
I have and again, I'm not saying, I like to separate policy and economics from emotion. And, those are real issues. The costs have to get passed somewhere, right?
Sure.
So what, in our closing few minutes here, we've talked about this book. I'm real excited about your next book about families and saving costs.
Cool. I am too. I've been working on it, so I'm almost done with it.
That's awesome. And so for this book, in the closing few minutes here, what would you like to impart? You lay out a roadmap for savings. You've talked about consumer-driven healthcare, people questioning their doctor and their healthcare provider. What other nuggets would you like to leave with the listeners here before we sign off?
Well, I think becoming an EHC, becoming an engaged healthcare consumer is such an important thing that there's so many different ways to do that. And look, I'm not a good salesperson. And the minute I start feeling like I'm selling, I stop because I get uncomfortable. So if you're not convinced from this conversation that you should go on Amazon and spend $15 on the book, or I think the other one's less than that, but go to my LinkedIn page and scroll down it and just read the stories, the long form stories. And if you want to be entertained, go to my post, because I'm really satirical and sarcastic, but truthful. And people, the third name besides healthcare futurist and edutainer, they call me as a truth teller, because I'm really pulling back the curtain on the hospital industry and insurers and saying, hey, let's be truthful with these folks. Let's let them know what's going on here. So engaging in the process is critical, and I can help educate you. And that's really my new mission. My new nickname is America's Healthcare Affordability Authority. And I'm on a mission, and you can see all this stuff at health-wealth.com to educate both businesses and families on how to bring costs down. It's going to take a few years to do that, but the number one thing you can do is engage. And engage means shop. Focus on personalized and preventative medicine. And Kurt, you talked about 2 or 3 of the really easy, turnkey, affordable ways to do that when we talked about DNA testing and we talked about integrative medicine earlier in this call, but those are great ways to do it. There's also local medical tourism. And even down in your part of the country, I got a buddy who needed a major procedure, and he's in one of the Carolinas, and he shopped it and ended up flying to Oklahoma, paying cash, and even with the plane ticket for he and his wife and paying cash, he saved a significant amount of money over getting it done at a local hospital or at a local facility. And you have great hospitals in North and South Carolina, right? I mean, you really do. You got great systems from Atrium, which used to be Carolinas, to UNC and so many others down there. So there's a lot to choose from. So in any case, just pay attention. And a starter kit to pay attention, go to health-wealth.com. We have blogs, podcasts, tools. We have an assessment you can take to see if you're doing well. And again, this is all through a not-for-profit. So now I'm starting to feel like I'm selling, so I'm going to stop.
No, please do.
You can also follow me at Josh Luke on Twitter, Josh Luke 4 Health, the number 4 Health. But really my main social platform is LinkedIn. I'm not on Facebook, by the way.
That is, there's an increasing number of people that aren't on Facebook, which is interesting, and I understand why. I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. Go get the book on Amazon. That's where I got it. Health Wealth, 9 Steps to Financial Recovery. Is healthcare bankrupting your business? Thanks, Dr. Luke, for mentioning all your social media handles. That's wonderful. I'm going to put them in the show notes as well, link to them. And I want to thank you for coming on the podcast.
Let me throw out a little promo for your listeners too. If you buy one of my books, Health, Wealth, or Execute, if you then go on and do a Amazon review on either of them, I will send you the other one for free. That's a pretty good deal. I want you to say, do the Amazon review, copy the link. You really don't even need to copy the link. Hit me up on LinkedIn, or you can email me at lukej@usc.edu. Luke J as in Josh at USC, University of Southern California. .edu, and I say, hey, I just did an Amazon review of one of your books. I was listening to Kurt's Freedom podcast, and you said you would send me the other one for free. I absolutely will. So that's a little promo for the first 5 of your listeners that do that. Okay.
That's excellent. And Dr. Luke is active on LinkedIn. I know because we met via a comment on Fabio Marama's.
Yeah, he's cool. In fact, I got a call with him later today, I think.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Luke. Thanks for coming aboard. We'll have to have you on again when the next book comes out.
It's my pleasure. And for any of your listeners who are doing a podcast, a webinar, or if you're a member of a trade organization, I am telling you, I will make you laugh and entertain your group as a speaker. That's what I do for a living. So if I could do an ask and sell, if you're a member of any type of group, human resources group, even just some sort of freedom trade club or whatever it might be, any type of trade, no matter what you're doing, that's what I do for a living. I travel the country and I come speak, and I will make you laugh. We'll give you a copy of the book for free if you do that. So reach out to me on LinkedIn and you can set that up as well. Thanks so much, Kurt. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luke. Thanks, everyone, for listening. This is the Freedom Club podcast. We'll talk to you soon.